November 14th, 2019, 10 in the evening. A call came into the Sacramento Emergency Services dispatch. A man's voice, quiet, nervous. Operator Jennifer Cole took the call. She had been in this position for 8 years, accustomed to everything. But this conversation immediately seemed strange. The caller reported hearing suspicious sounds from the neighboring house, Maple Street, House 47. Cole began to ask questions. "What exactly are you hearing?" The caller replied, "Like moans or screams, hard to make out." "How long has this been going on?" "Several days, maybe a week. These sounds repeat at night." Cole asked for a name. A pause. The caller didn't answer. A minute later, the call disconnected. According to protocol, such calls are always checked. The duty officer dispatched the nearest patrol. Officers Brian Miller and Kevin Thompson left a few minutes later. Maple Street is a quiet residential area. Single-story houses, well-maintained yards. The patrol car pulled up to House 47 around 11 in the evening. The officers got out and looked around. An ordinary house, freshly painted, with a mowed lawn. The windows were dark. No sounds. Complete silence. Thompson approached the front door and knocked. Waited. Knocked louder. Steps were heard from inside. The door opened. A man in his 50s stood on the doorstep. Neat. Calm. He introduced himself as Robert Hughes, the homeowner. He asked what was the matter. Thompson explained a report had come in about strange sounds from this address. Hughes was surprised. Said he lived alone and had no problems. Perhaps they had the wrong house. The officer asked permission to inspect the premises, a standard procedure. Hughes nodded and invited them inside. They walked through the living room. Clean, tidy. The kitchen, dishes washed. The bathroom, one toothbrush. Hughes indeed lived alone. The bedroom, a made bed, a book on the nightstand. Everything looked normal. Miller noticed a closed door at the end of the corridor, the only room they hadn't checked. He asked what was in there. Hughes replied immediately, a pantry, old things, boxes. He hadn't been in there for months. Thompson asked him to open it, just to finish the check. Hughes froze. For the first time, his face changed. He said he had lost the key to that room last spring, saw no point in calling a locksmith for a pantry. Miller frowned. A strange explanation. Who loses a key to a room in their own house and doesn't change the lock for almost a year? Thompson insisted, said they needed to check all premises. Either Hughes opens it or they call for backup. Hughes was silent for a few seconds. Then he slowly pulled a set of keys from his pocket. He walked to the door. His hands trembled slightly. He inserted the key into the lock but didn't turn it immediately. He paused. "They're just old things in there." Thompson nodded. Hughes turned the key. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. A stale smell wafted from the gap, a mixture of dust, dampness, and something else. Hughes pushed the door wider. Darkness inside. He turned on the light. And what the officers saw completely changed the situation. It wasn't a pantry. It was a living room. Small, 10 or maybe 12 square meters. An old mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, empty water bottles, leftover food on paper plates, and a woman. She sat on the mattress, leaning against the wall. Thin, very thin. Her hair matted, long. Her clothes dirty, worn out. She raised her head and looked at the light. She squinted, as if unaccustomed to bright illumination. Miller froze. Thompson stepped forward. Hughes stood by the door, silent. The woman didn't speak. She just looked at the officers, her gaze empty, detached. Thompson asked who she was. The woman didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, barely audibly, she said, "Mary. My name is Mary." Miller turned to Hughes, asked what was happening here. Hughes was silent. He lowered his gaze. Thompson immediately called for backup. A few minutes later, 2 more patrol cars pulled up to the house. Hughes was led out of the house and put into a car. The woman was carefully led out of the room. She walked slowly, unsteadily, holding on to the wall. Medics arrived 10 minutes later. They examined the woman on the spot. Dehydration, exhaustion. She was immediately taken to the hospital, and Robert Hughes remained under arrest. Officers began to ask questions. Who was this woman? How long had she been in that room? Why was the door locked? Hughes was silent, refused to answer without a lawyer. Only a few hours later, when detectives began checking documents and questioning neighbors, the first facts emerged. Mary Hughes, Robert's wife. Officially married since 2001, she was last seen in the neighborhood in 2003, 16 years ago. Neighbors were sure that Mary had not lived in that house for a long time. Robert told everyone that his wife was undergoing treatment in a specialized clinic, mental health issues. He visited her sometimes, but doctors didn't recommend frequent visits. All these years, no one asked questions. Robert was a quiet, polite neighbor, paid his taxes on time, mowed the lawn, greeted everyone. And all this time his wife was in a locked room a few meters away from them. Detectives began to reconstruct the timeline. They needed to understand how a woman could disappear for 16 years and no one notice. First, they questioned the neighbors. Maple Street is a small neighborhood where everyone knows each other. Neighbor Barbara King had lived there for 30 years. She remembered Robert and Mary well. The couple moved in 2001. Robert was an accountant, Mary a librarian. Quiet, polite. Barbara last saw Mary in the spring of 2003. Mary was trimming flowers in the yard. They greeted each other. An ordinary day. A few weeks later, Barbara asked Robert where his wife was. Robert replied calmly, "Mary is undergoing treatment. Health problems. Doctors insist on long-term therapy." Barbara didn't press for details. She wished her well and didn't bring up the topic again. Neighbor James Porter moved there in 2005. Robert immediately mentioned that his wife was in a specialized facility. James accepted this as a fact. Robert seemed like a normal neighbor. He greeted people, helped with repairs, mowed the lawn. Other neighbors confirmed. Robert told everyone the same thing. His wife was undergoing treatment, rare visits were allowed, doctors recommended minimal contact. No one checked. Why? Robert didn't hide that he was married, he just said she was getting treatment. Detectives pulled Mary's medical records. Last doctor's visit, February 2003. After that, nothing. Not a single record in clinics in California or neighboring states. Bank accounts. Last transaction, April 18, 2003. A withdrawal of $40. Then the account went dormant for 16 years. Phone records. Last call, April 20th, 2003. Her friend Susan Miller called. Mary said she felt unwell and planned to take a vacation. A week later, Susan called again. Robert answered the phone. He said Mary was still not well, and doctors recommended extending her rest. A month later, Robert reported that Mary had been admitted to a clinic. Serious nervous system problems. Visits were not recommended. Susan asked for the clinic's name. Robert answered evasively. A specialized facility. Doctors insist on confidentiality. Susan sent a get well card. She received no reply. Over time, contact ceased. Life went on. Mary's mother, Elizabeth Johnson, last spoke to her daughter in April 2003. Mary complained of fatigue, headaches. A few weeks later, Robert called. He reported that Mary was in a clinic, nervous exhaustion. Doctors had forbidden visits. Elizabeth became worried, but Robert reassured her. He said he regularly visited his wife and her condition was stable. Elizabeth asked for the clinic's address. Robert promised to provide it as soon as the doctors allowed. Permission never came. In 2007, Elizabeth passed away. Robert attended the funeral. He said Mary couldn't come, her condition wouldn't allow it. No one doubted. Detectives retrieved Robert's interrogation protocols. He gave testimony through a lawyer. He claimed that in the spring of 2003, Mary began to have fits of aggression. She screamed, broke dishes, threatened herself. Robert tried to persuade her to see a psychiatrist. Mary refused. Her condition worsened. Robert decided to place her in a separate room, temporarily until she stabilized. He brought her food, water, and cared for her. But the temporary measure became permanent. The lawyer interrupted the interrogation, said his client was under stress. Now detectives had to find out exactly what happened 16 years ago. Detectives collected all the photos of Mary they could find, family albums, phone records from relatives, old social media posts. The last photo was dated April 12, 2003, Mary's mother, Elizabeth's, birthday. A family celebration at a restaurant. In the picture, Mary sits at a table, smiling. Next to her are Robert, her mother, and her cousin. An ordinary family photograph. 8 days later, Mary disappeared. Detectives reconstructed the exact chronology. On April 18, Mary withdrew $40 from an ATM, her last financial transaction. On April 20, she called her friend Susan, complaining of fatigue, her last phone conversation. After that, silence. Relatives recounted that as early as March 2003, Robert began to limit their contact with Mary. Mary's sister, Jennifer, recalled a strange incident. She called Mary in early March, wanting to invite her for the weekend. Robert answered the phone. He said Mary was resting, feeling unwell. Jennifer asked her to call back later. Robert promised to relay the message. Mary didn't call back. Jennifer called again a week later. Robert answered again. The same story. Mary was sleeping, tired, would call back herself. Jennifer became worried. She went to their house without warning. Robert opened the door, looking calm. He said Mary had gone to bed after lunch. Doctors recommended more rest. Jennifer asked him to wake her sister. Robert refused. He said Mary needed peace and quiet. The conversation at the doorstep lasted several minutes. Robert was polite but insistent. Jennifer left without seeing her sister. This was March 10, 2003. After her mother's birthday on April 12th, they saw each other for the last time. Mary's cousin, Michael Johnson, also noticed changes. In February, he came to Mary and Robert's for dinner. Everything was normal.
Mary cooked. They talked, laughed. In late March, Michael called and suggested they do it again. Robert replied that it wasn't a good time. Mary wasn't feeling well. Michael offered help. Robert refused. He said he was managing on his own. Michael didn't insist further. He had his own family, his job. He thought Mary was just overworked. After April 20, contact ceased completely. Robert began to tell everyone the same story. Mary was in a clinic, a specialized facility. Treatment would take time. Sister Jennifer demanded the clinic's address. Robert replied that doctors had forbidden visits. Mary's condition was unstable and external contact could hurt her. Jennifer insisted. Robert promised to provide the information later. Later never came. Jennifer called every week for the first 2 months. Robert always answered patiently. He said Mary was still undergoing therapy. There were improvements, but they were slow. Doctors asked not to rush the process. 3 months later, Jennifer asked to speak directly with the doctors. Robert refused. He said it would violate patient confidentiality. Mary herself didn't want relatives to interfere. Jennifer began to suspect something was wrong. She hired a private detective in the summer of 2003. The detective checked all psychiatric clinics within a 100-mile radius of Sacramento. Mary was not registered anywhere. Jennifer called Robert with this information. Robert didn't lose his composure. He explained that the clinic was in another state, a specialized center treating rare disorders. Doctors insisted on complete confidentiality. Jennifer wanted to file a missing person report, but formally, Mary hadn't disappeared anywhere. Her husband knew where she was. Legally, everything was clean. The lawyer Jennifer consulted explained the situation. An adult has the right to medical treatment. The husband, as the closest relative, can make decisions. If there is no evidence of a crime, the police will not investigate. Jennifer gave up. She continued to call Robert, but less frequently. Once a month, then once a quarter. The answers were always the same. Mary was undergoing treatment. Her condition was stable. Visits were not yet possible. Years passed. Jennifer got married, moved to Oregon. Life consumed her. Mary became a painful topic she didn't want to think about. By 2010, the relatives had resigned themselves. Mary was somewhere in a clinic and Robert was taking care of her. They saw no other options. No one knew that all this time Mary was just a few meters from the front door, in a locked room in the house on Maple Street. Robert created a perfect cover. He didn't deny his wife's existence. He didn't say she had died or left forever. He simply controlled the information. He answered calls, gave updates, promised improvements, and no one could verify his words. After Robert Hughes's arrest, detectives returned to the house on Maple Street, now with a warrant for a full search. They needed to understand exactly what had been happening in that room for 16 years. Detective David Harris was appointed lead investigator, 30 years in the police force, experience with serious crimes, but even he later admitted he had never seen anything like it. The room was small, 3.5 by 3 meters, one window boarded up from the outside, no light penetrated. The only source of illumination was a light bulb on the ceiling, a mattress on the floor, dirty, old, with signs of long use. The blanket was thin, torn in several places. The pillow had no pillowcase. In the corner of the room stood a plastic bucket. It was used as a toilet. The smell was accordingly foul. Detectives found empty water bottles, about 20, maybe more. Paper plates with leftover food, bread, dry, covered in mold. Cans open, empty. Scratches on the wall, many scratches. Mary counted the days, first neatly, then more chaotically. Detectives tried to count. It came out to about 5,000 marks. That's approximately 14 years. Then the scratches stopped. Forensic experts took samples from all surfaces. DNA, fingerprints, hair. Everything indicated that Mary had been in that room continuously. The door was examined separately. A lock on the outside, no opening mechanism from the inside. Mary physically could not have left on her own. There were also marks on the inside of the door, scratches from fingernails, abrasions from impacts. Mary had tried to get out, many times. Detective Harris examined the ventilation system.
A narrow gap under the door, a small opening in the wall, minimal airflow, enough not to suffocate, no more. The window was boarded up from the outside, nails driven deep, thick planks.
Even if Mary had broken the glass, she wouldn't have been able to remove the boards from the inside. Forensic experts found old clothes in the corner, t-shirts, pants, all dirty, worn out. The size matched Mary. Detectives assumed Robert sometimes gave her clean clothes, but rarely. A notebook was found under the mattress, old, worn. Mary had kept notes. The first pages, coherent thoughts, dates, events, attempts to understand what was happening. The entries became increasingly chaotic. By the middle of the notebook, just fragments of phrases. Please let me out. I want to go home. Mom. The last pages were blank. Detectives seized the notebook as evidence. Handwriting experts confirmed it was Mary's handwriting. The degradation of the handwriting corresponded to prolonged psychological stress. Robert was reinterrogated. This time, Detective Harris asked questions directly. How often did you bring food? Robert replied, once a day, sometimes twice. Water? Every day. Could she leave? No. Never. Robert paused, then said, in the first months, he sometimes let her into the bathroom, under supervision. Then he stopped. Too risky. Harris asked about medical care.
Robert replied that Mary had never been seriously ill. He treated colds himself. He bought medicines at the pharmacy. Detectives checked Robert's purchases over the past years. Bank statements, receipts, regular spending on food, water, simple medications. The quantity of groceries corresponded to 2 people, not 1. Neighbors confirmed Robert often brought grocery bags, more than one person needed, but no one thought anything of it. Maybe he was stocking up. Detective Harris reconstructed the routine. Robert had worked remotely as an accountant since 2005. He was home almost all the time. He went to the store, sometimes met with neighbors, but he spent most of his time in the house. Every day he opened the door to the room, brought food, took the bucket, removed waste, gave water, closed the door back. 16 years of the same routine. Psychologists who studied the case noted signs of an extreme form of control. Robert created a system where Mary was completely dependent on him. Food, water, light, he controlled everything. The first clue that could have revealed the crime earlier turned out to be the simplest. An anonymous call on November 14th, 2019.
Someone heard moans from the house. Detectives never identified the caller. The number was a disposable one bought with cash. The trail went cold. But that call saved Mary. Without it, she could have spent years more in that room. While forensic experts worked in the house, Detective Harris requested a full background check on Robert Hughes. Biography, criminal history, financial data, medical records. Robert Hughes, 64 years old, born in California, specialized secondary education, worked as an accountant for small firms. Since 2005, remote work on a contract basis. Stable income, paid taxes on time. Criminal record, clean. Not a single arrest, not a single charge. There weren't even traffic fines. An exemplary citizen. Harris checked Robert's medical records. Last doctor's visit, a routine checkup a year ago. No mental abnormalities in the diagnoses. An ordinary, healthy, middle-aged man. Neighbors confirmed. A calm, quiet man. He didn't conflict, didn't complain. Helped with small tasks. kept the house in order. Nothing that would indicate a propensity for crime. But there was one problem: Mary Hughes. Harris initiated a check across all databases: medical facilities in California, psychiatric clinics, rehabilitation centers. Then he expanded the search to neighboring states: Nevada, Oregon, Arizona. The result: 0. Mary was not listed anywhere. Harris checked federal databases, all specialized institutions in the country, private clinics, state centers, closed boarding houses. Mary Hughes was not registered anywhere. For 16 years, Robert claimed his wife was undergoing treatment. Relatives believed it, friends believed it, neighbors believed it. But there was no treatment. Harris checked insurance records. Mary had health insurance through her employer. It was valid until April 2003. After her termination, the insurance was canceled. Robert did not arrange new insurance for his wife. He did not submit documents for treatment. He did not request compensation for medical expenses. If Mary had truly been in a clinic for 16 years, it would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Robert could not have paid for this from his income, but there were no loans, no debts in his financial records. Harris interrogated Robert again, asked directly, in which clinic was Mary? Robert was silent.
His lawyer advised him not to answer. Harris presented the results of the check. Mary was not registered anywhere. No medical records, no payments for treatment. The entire story about the clinic was a fabrication. Robert lowered his gaze, then said quietly, "She was home, all the time." The lawyer tried to interrupt the interrogation, but Robert continued. He said he couldn't send his wife to a real clinic. He was afraid her condition would worsen. He decided to take care of her himself. Harris asked the next question: "Why did you keep her locked up?" Robert replied, "She was dangerous, to herself and to others. I was protecting her." Harris asked, "From whom?" Robert fell silent. Detectives checked Robert's version against Mary's medical records prior to 2003. Last visit to a psychiatrist: never. Last visit to a therapist: a routine checkup, no complaints about her mental state. Mary's colleagues from the library recalled no oddities. She was a normal employee, calm, friendly, no fits of aggression, no signs of disorder. Relatives confirmed Mary never displayed aggression. There were no incidents, conflicts, or strange behavior. Robert's version did not match the facts.
Harris understood. The story about his wife's illness was a cover. Robert kept Mary in that room not for treatment, but for control. The prosecution began to build its case: unlawful confinement, possibly kidnapping, possibly torture. It depended on Mary's testimony and medical reports. Robert was officially charged. Bail was not granted. Too high a flight risk. Robert's lawyer tried to build the defense, claimed his client acted with good intentions, wanted to help his wife, didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. The prosecutor rejected this version. 16 years was not a mistake. It was a conscious decision. Robert knew what he was doing. He kept his wife locked up, controlled every aspect of her life, and lied to everyone around him. Now the main thing remained to be understood: what exactly happened in April 2003 that made Robert lock his wife in that room? Detectives began a detailed questioning of everyone who knew Mary and Robert before 2003. They needed a complete picture of the relationships in this family. Mary's sister Jennifer testified first. She recounted details that had previously seemed insignificant, but now they formed a disturbing picture.
Robert and Mary married in 2001. They met through mutual friends, dated for about a year. The wedding was modest. Mary seemed happy. Jennifer noticed the first changes about 6 months after the wedding. Mary started calling less often. Before, they communicated every day, now once a week. Jennifer asked if everything was all right. Mary replied, yes, just a lot of work, getting tired. Jennifer didn't insist. Then Mary quit her job at the library. This was in early 2002. Jennifer was surprised. Mary loved her job, had worked there for 8 years. She asked about the reasons. Mary explained, Robert thought she was getting too tired. He suggested she stay home, take care of the house. They had a stable income, her salary wasn't critical. Jennifer became wary. Mary had never been a homemaker. She loved working, interacting with people, but Mary insisted the decision was voluntary. A few months later, Jennifer noticed another oddity. Mary no longer managed her own money. Previously, she had a personal account and paid for purchases herself. Now, Robert controlled all finances. Jennifer asked directly, why? Mary replied that Robert was better with money. He was an accountant, knew how to plan a budget. She felt more at ease that way. Jennifer suggested Mary meet for lunch. Mary refused. She said Robert didn't approve of frequent meetings with relatives. He felt it distracted from family. This was 2002, a year before her disappearance. Mary's friend, Susan Miller, confirmed a similar picture. After the wedding, Mary changed, became withdrawn, anxious. Susan recalled a conversation in early 2002. They were drinking coffee at the library during lunch. Mary looked tired. Susan asked if everything was all right at home. Mary paused, then said that Robert was very attentive, sometimes too much so. He always wanted to know where she was, who she was talking to, what she was doing. He called several times a day. Susan asked if Mary felt controlled. Mary denied it. She said Robert was just caring. He worried about her. After Mary quit her job, they saw each other less often. Susan called, suggested meeting. Mary always found excuses. Busy, feeling unwell, Robert was against it. Their last meeting was in March 2003. Mary looked exhausted. She had lost weight, with dark circles under her eyes. Susan became worried, offered help. Mary refused, said she would manage herself, asked not to call often. Robert didn't like her being distracted by conversations. Cousin Michael talked about money. In 2002, he lent Robert $5,000. Robert explained it was temporary difficulties and he would return it in a month. He returned the money on time, but Michael noticed a strange detail. Robert asked him not to mention the loan to Mary, said he didn't want to worry her. Michael agreed, but later he wondered, why would a husband hide financial problems from his wife? They were a family. They should solve everything together. Detectives gathered all these testimonies. The picture became clearer. Robert had isolated Mary long before 2003, first from work, then from friends, then from relatives. He took control of her money, controlled her contacts, movements, communication. This was not a sudden reaction to his wife's illness. It was a systematic process. A psychologist consulting the investigation explained a classic pattern of a domestic abuser: gradual isolation of the victim from the outside world, control over all aspects of life, creation of complete dependency. By April 2003, Mary was already socially and financially isolated. Robert simply took the next step. He isolated her physically. Detective Harris obtained all necessary grounds for an in-depth investigation. Testimonies from relatives, financial records, colleagues' statements. Now the case was not just about a locked room. It was a case of years of control, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of another person's identity. While detectives were gathering testimonies from relatives, other work was being done in parallel. After it became clear that Mary was not registered anywhere, Robert Hughes became the main suspect. But formally, there was nothing to charge him with. Strong grounds were required to obtain a search warrant. Relatives' testimonies about control and isolation were not enough. Detectives set up covert surveillance on the house on Maple Street. Officers worked in 2 shifts, 24-hour surveillance, recording all of Robert's movements, contacts, purchases. What they saw was strange precisely because of its normality. Robert behaved absolutely normally. Every morning, at 8 o'clock, he went out into the yard, checked the mailbox, watered the lawn on dry days, greeted neighbors if they passed by. Tuesdays and Fridays, trips to the grocery store. Robert bought groceries for the week, always the same items: bread, canned goods, water, vegetables, meat. The quantity was more than one person needed, but not critically so. Officers recorded every purchase. Robert paid with cash. He was never in a hurry, spoke politely to cashiers, smiled. On Wednesdays, he mowed the lawn, evenly, neatly. He worked for about an hour. Then he put the tools away in the garage and returned to the house. No signs of stress, no nervousness, no attempts to hide anything or change his usual routine. Detective Harris reviewed the surveillance footage every evening. It was precisely this calm that bothered him. A man whose wife had disappeared 16 years ago acted as if everything was normal. Officers noted one interesting point. Every day around 7 in the evening, Robert went into the kitchen. He prepared dinner, but the portions were strange. The observer saw through the window. Robert placed food on 2 plates. He left one on the table. He took the second and went deeper into the house. 20 minutes later, he returned with an empty plate, washed it. Then he sat down at the table and had his own dinner. This repeated every evening. Detectives speculated. Perhaps Robert was feeding someone in the house. But who? Officially, he lived alone. Harris requested recordings from surveillance cameras of nearby houses. He found footage from the past few months. Robert regularly took out the trash, 2 bags every week. For one person, that was quite a lot. One more detail. Robert never opened the windows in one part of the house. Officers checked the architectural plans. There should have been a room there, but the window always remained closed, curtains drawn. Even on hot days when Robert opened all other windows for ventilation, this one remained closed. Harris asked to check utility bills. Robert's water consumption was above average for a single person, not critical but noticeable. Electricity, too. Robert used more energy than a typical solitary resident. All these details individually proved nothing, but together they formed a picture. The surveillance continued for 2 weeks. Robert never deviated from his routine, never showed any concern. Never did anything suspicious. It was precisely this pathological calm that alarmed the detectives most of all. Harris consulted with a psychologist. He described Robert's behavior. The psychologist's opinion was, the person acts as if absolutely certain of his safety. He's not afraid of exposure. He believes his secret is securely hidden. This intensified suspicions. Detectives began gathering formal grounds for a warrant. Relatives' testimonies, oddities in behavior, inconsistencies in the story about his wife's treatment. And it was at this moment, after 2 weeks of surveillance, that the anonymous call came in about strange sounds from the house on Maple Street. The anonymous call gave detectives what they needed: formal grounds for an immediate check. Patrol officers were already at the house, already witnessed Robert's strange reaction to the request to open one of the rooms. Detective Harris obtained an emergency search warrant within an hour. A team of 6 officers and 2 forensic experts set out for the house on Maple Street. It was around midnight when they knocked on the door. Robert opened it. He looked calm, even slightly irritated. He asked what was happening.
Harris presented the warrant, explained that they were conducting a search in connection with the report of a possible crime. Robert read the document silently, nodded, invited them inside. Officers started on the first floor. Living room, kitchen, bathroom, Robert's bedroom. They checked every closet, every drawer. They looked for traces of another person's presence. They found minimal evidence. 1 toothbrush in the bathroom, 1 cup in the kitchen, only men's clothes in the closet. Everything indicated that Robert indeed lived alone. Harris didn't believe it. Too many details didn't add up. Double portions of food, increased water consumption, a closed window. Officers went down the corridor. There were 3 doors. 2 were open, a toilet and another small room with boxes. The 3rd door was closed. Harris asked Robert to open it. Robert gave the same answer he had given the patrol officers hours ago. It's a pantry. The key was lost a long time ago. Harris didn't argue. He ordered the officers to break down the door. Robert didn't object. He stood aside, watching silently. Officer Miller broke the lock with a crowbar. The door opened. And what they saw behind it made everyone freeze. It wasn't a pantry. A small room, about 10 square meters. A musty smell immediately hit their noses. A mattress on the floor, a dirty blanket, a bucket in the corner, empty bottles, leftover food, and a woman. She sat on the mattress, pressed against the wall. Thin, emaciated, her hair matted, long, almost to her waist, her clothes dirty. She raised her head when the light came on. She squinted. She looked at the officers, not saying a word. Harris stepped into the room, quietly asked, "What's your name?" The woman was silent for a few seconds. Then, barely audibly, "Mary." Harris turned to Robert. He stood by the door. His face was still as calm. Harris asked, "Who is this woman?" Robert answered without a pause, "My wife." "How long has she been here?" Robert looked at Mary, then at Harris. Quietly, "A long time." Officers called an ambulance. Medics arrived 10 minutes later. They examined Mary on the spot. Dehydration, exhaustion, multiple signs of prolonged confinement in an enclosed space. She was led out of the room. She walked slowly, holding on to the wall. Her legs barely obeyed her. Medics supported her from both sides.
Robert was immediately arrested. His rights were read. He listened silently, did not resist. Officers handcuffed him and led him to the car. Forensic experts remained to work in the house. They had to document every detail of that room, every scratch on the wall, every mark on the floor. Harris examined the door from the inside. No lock, no handle, only a smooth surface. Mary could not have left on her own, no matter how much she wanted to. Scratches on the wall, thousands of scratches. Mary had counted the days. Harris tried to count. Approximately 5,000 marks. That was 14 years. Then the marks stopped. Forensic experts found a notebook under the mattress, pages covered in small handwriting. The first entries were coherent, the last ones, fragments of phrases. All of this would become evidence. All of this would prove that Robert Hughes had kept his wife locked up for 16 years. But for now, detectives needed to understand the main thing. What made him do it? Forensic experts began a detailed inspection of the room the next morning.
A team of 5 specialists worked under the direction of expert Robert Chen.
He had 20 years of experience, hundreds of crime scene inspections under his belt, but he would later call this case one of the most disturbing. First, the entire room was photographed, every corner, every detail. Then they began a methodical analysis. The door was examined especially thoroughly. From the outside, a normal lock, but from the inside, no handle, no mechanism. The door only opened from the outside. Expert Chen noticed signs of modification. The door was originally a standard interior door, but someone had reinforced it, added a metal plate from the inside, installed a stronger lock. The work was done neatly, professionally. Robert had clearly spent time preparing. The window was checked next, boards nailed from the outside. From the inside, the glass was intact, but the boards made it useless. Even if the glass were broken, there was no getting out. Expert Chen measured the ventilation gaps, a narrow strip under the door, a small opening in the wall near the ceiling, minimal airflow. The expert calculated air exchange was about 30% of the norm for a room of that size. Enough not to suffocate, not enough for comfort.
The walls were examined centimeter by centimeter. Scratches covered almost the entire surface at the level of a person sitting on the mattress. Experts took samples. Analysis showed the scratches were made with fingernails. Under the microscope, traces of skin and blood were visible. Mary had scratched the walls for years. Her nails wore down, broke, bled, but she continued. The mattress was removed for examination. DNA analysis confirmed one woman had been on it for a long time. Traces of biological materials matched Mary Hughes. The bucket in the corner also became evidence. Experts determined it had been used as a toilet for at least 10 years, perhaps longer. The water bottles were collected and counted, 23 of them, all of one brand that Robert regularly bought at the local store. Detectives checked the receipts. Robert had been buying this water in packs of 12 bottles every 2 weeks for the past several years. A simple calculation showed 1 pack every 2 weeks, that's approximately 2 bottles a day. 1 for Robert, 1 for Mary. Leftover food was sent for analysis. Canned goods, bread, simple products, nothing perishable.
Robert brought food that could be stored for a long time. Expert Chen compiled a detailed report. His conclusions were unequivocal. The room was deliberately modified, the door reinforced, the lock specifically installed, the window blocked from the outside, ventilation minimal. This was not a temporary solution. This was a deliberate construction for the prolonged detention of a person. Chen also noted the absence of any means of entertainment or occupation. No books, no radio, no television. Only a mattress, a bucket, and walls. A psychologist consulting on the examination provided his conclusion. The conditions of confinement corresponded to an isolation cell in a maximum security prison. But even in prisons, inmates have more rights: walks, medical care, contact with people. Mary had none of this for 16 years. Detectives found another detail. Tools were discovered in Robert's garage: a drill, a saw, a hammer, everything clean, neatly stacked. Experts compared the marks on the door with these tools, a complete match. Robert had remodeled the room himself. They checked hardware store records. Robert bought materials in April 2003. A metal plate, a lock, boards, nails. Everything needed for the room's modification. This happened precisely at the time when Mary disappeared from public life. Now, The picture was complete. Robert didn't act impulsively. He planned. He prepared the room, bought materials, modified the door. And then he locked his wife inside for 16 years. After his arrest, Robert was interrogated several times. For the first 24 hours he remained silent, answering only through his lawyer. But on the third day, his tactic changed. Robert requested a meeting with Detective Harris. He said he was ready to give testimony. His lawyer was present, but Robert insisted on speaking. Harris turned on the voice recorder. Robert began to speak. He claimed that everything he did for Mary's sake. In the spring of 2003, she began to experience serious problems, bouts of depression, aggression, attempts to harm herself. Robert described specific episodes. March 2003, Mary broke a mirror in the bathroom. April, she tried to cut her wrists with a piece of glass. Robert stopped her, removed all sharp objects from the house. Harris listened silently. Robert continued.
He said Mary refused to see doctors. She was afraid she would be forcibly committed to a psychiatric clinic. She asked Robert not to call emergency services, not to tell relatives. According to Robert, it was Mary who asked to be isolated. She said she didn't trust herself. She was afraid she would do something irreparable. Robert agreed to temporarily lock her in the room at night. The temporary solution became permanent. Mary's condition worsened. Robert was afraid to leave her alone, continued to keep her locked up. Years passed. The situation didn't change. Harris asked, "Why didn't you seek professional help?" Robert replied, "Mary categorically refused, pleaded not to be sent to a clinic." Robert promised to take care of her himself. The lawyer handed the detective a folder with documents, medical records. Robert had kept them all these years. Harris reviewed the papers. A record from 1999, Mary consulted a psychologist with complaints of depression. A course of antidepressants was prescribed. A record from 2001, a repeated consultation. Mary complained of anxiety, sleep problems. The psychologist recommended continuing therapy. The last record, February 2003.
Mary visited a therapist. No mention of suicidal thoughts or aggression, but a diagnosis of depressive disorder was present. Robert used these documents as evidence. Mary indeed had mental health issues. His version gained some basis. Harris took the documents, said that forensics would verify their authenticity. Robert nodded calmly. Detectives sent the records for verification. The documents turned out to be authentic. Mary had indeed been treated for depression until 2003. But experts pointed out an important detail. Depression does not equal aggression. The diagnosis Mary had did not imply danger to others. It was an internal state, not an external one. Harris requested a consultation with a psychiatrist. The specialist reviewed Mary's medical records, concluded nothing in these documents indicated the need for isolation. Depressive disorder is treated with therapy and medication, not by locking someone in a room. Moreover, prolonged isolation would only have worsened Mary's condition. This contradicted any reasonable treatment. Detectives questioned the doctors who treated Mary before 2003. Psychologist Sarah Thompson remembered her well, said Mary was a calm patient. No signs of aggression, no talks about wanting to isolate herself. The doctor categorically refuted Robert's version. But formally, the investigation was obliged to check all details. The defense's version, however absurd it seemed, required refutation through facts. Robert's lawyer began to build a defense line, claimed his client acted out of a distorted but sincere sense of care. He didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. He thought he was helping his wife. The prosecutor prepared counterarguments.
16 years was not a mistake. Systematic control, lies to relatives, modification of the room, all pointed to conscious actions. But until Mary's own testimony was obtained, the case remained open to different interpretations. The court ordered a mandatory forensic psychiatric evaluation of Robert Hughes. 2 specialists worked with him for 3 weeks, a series of tests, interviews, behavior analysis. The lead expert was Dr. Elizabeth Grant, 30 years of practice, specializing in personality disorders. She conducted 12 sessions with Robert. The results were telling. Dr. Grant identified signs of narcissistic personality disorder in Robert. A pathological need for control, an inability to empathize, the perception of other people as objects for manipulation. In the report, the expert described characteristic traits. Robert displayed a complete lack of guilt for his actions. During the sessions, he spoke of Mary as a problem that needed to be solved, not as a person. Dr. Grant noted, Robert genuinely believed his actions were correct, not because he cared for his wife, but because he established an order that he deemed necessary. Detectives began to dig deeper into Robert's past. They requested information about his work before 2005. Something interesting came to light. Robert worked as an accountant at Davidson and Partners from 1998 to 2004. He was fired in August 2004. The official reason was staff reduction. Detective Harris found Robert's former colleagues. They told a different story. Manager Thomas Davidson remembered Robert well, described him as a competent but strange employee. Robert tried to control the work of other departments, gave unsolicited advice, insisted that colleagues follow his methods. When he was refused, Robert reacted aggressively, not physically, but psychologically, spread rumors, undermined the authority of those who contradicted him. Davidson tried to talk to Robert, explained that such behavior was unacceptable. Robert formally agreed, but changed nothing. Conflicts continued. In early 2004, Robert's colleague, Jennifer Parker, complained about his behavior. Robert constantly criticized her work, tried to control every detail. Jennifer felt pressured. Management conducted an investigation. Several employees confirmed Robert created a toxic atmosphere, tried to manipulate people, did not recognize boundaries. The company offered Robert to resign voluntarily or be fired for cause. Robert chose the former. Officially, it was recorded as a staff reduction. After being fired, Robert transitioned to remote work, contracts with small firms, minimal interaction with people. Detectives found another fact. In 2002, Robert and Mary's neighbor, Barbara King, complained about Robert's strange behavior. Barbara recounted Robert had several times made remarks about her yard, said she mowed the lawn incorrectly, that her fence was painted the wrong color, that her car was parked inconveniently. Barbara initially ignored him. Then Robert became more intrusive. He approached her every week with new remarks. Barbara asked him to leave her alone. Robert took offense, stopped greeting her, ignored Barbara completely. Dr. Grant included all these facts in her analysis, concluded Robert exhibits a persistent pattern of controlling behavior. This is not a situational reaction. It is part of his personality. The second expert, Dr. Michael Cheng, confirmed the findings, added an important detail. Robert is incapable of perceiving other people as equals. He sees them either as objects of control or as a threat to his control. Mary was entirely under his power, dependent financially, socially, physically. For Robert, this was an ideal scenario. The defense's version that Robert acted out of care fell apart. Experts categorically rejected it. Dr. Grant wrote in her conclusion,
The motive for the defendant's actions was the exercise of power and control. The story about the victim's request to isolate herself does not correspond to the psychological profile of either the defendant or the victim. The prosecutor got what he needed. The expert opinion completely dismantled Robert's defense. Now the main testimony remained to be heard. Mary's own statements. Detective Harris entered the interrogation room with a thick folder of documents. Robert sat at the table, his lawyer beside him. Cameras were turned on. Recording began. Harris placed the psychiatric evaluation report on the table. A voluminous document, 40 pages. He asked Robert to review it. Robert read silently. His face remained calm. He finished, put the papers aside, said, "The experts are mistaken." Harris asked, "In what exactly?" Robert replied, "They don't know Mary. They don't understand the situation. He genuinely cared for his wife. Everything he did was necessary." Harris took out photos, the room where Mary was kept, the mattress on the floor, the bucket in the corner, scratches on the walls, the boarded-up window. He laid the photos before Robert, asked, "Is this care?" Robert looked at the pictures, did not look away, said, "Yes, Mary was safe. He controlled the situation." Harris showed the next photo, the door without a handle from the inside, reinforced lock, metal plate. He asked, "Why reinforce the door if your wife herself asked for isolation?" Robert paused, then replied, "She could have changed her mind. In a fit, she might try to get out. That would have been dangerous." Harris took out the relatives' testimonies. He read out the words of Mary's sister. Robert had isolated her long before 2003. He controlled her money, friends, and work. Robert listened without emotion. He said, "I helped Mary make the right decisions. She was weak, indecisive. She needed guidance." The lawyer tried to intervene. He said that these questions were not relevant to the case. Harris countered, "This directly relates to the motive." The interrogation continued. Harris methodically dismantled Robert's version. He pointed out inconsistencies and contradictions. Why hadn't they seen doctors for 16 years? Robert replied, "Mary was afraid of clinics." Why did the neighbors know nothing? Robert replied, "It was a family problem." Why wasn't Mary allowed out even for a walk? Robert replied, "Too risky." Harris showed entries from Mary's notebook. "Please let me out. I want to go home." He read them aloud. He asked, "This looks like a plea for help, not gratitude for care." Robert was silent. For the first time during the entire interrogation, he didn't immediately have an answer. Harris continued. He showed financial records. Robert bought materials for modifying the room in April 2003. Metal, a lock, planks. All this was before Mary's alleged aggressive outbursts began. He asked, "Were you preparing a prison in advance?" The lawyer objected. He said that it was an interpretation, not a fact. Robert could have been buying materials for other purposes. Harris took out receipts. He read, "Metal plate, reinforced lock, heavy-duty hinges. What else could be made from this other than reinforcing a door?" Robert said, "I was preparing, just in case it was needed." Harris asked, "Needed for what? To lock your wife up for 16 years? Robert did not answer. The interrogation lasted 4 hours. Harris pressed with facts, testimonies, and evidence. Robert held his ground, but cracks began to appear. In the 5th hour, Harris asked a direct question. "Do you admit that you held Mary against her will?" Robert looked at his lawyer. The lawyer shook his head. Robert answered anyway. "She couldn't make decisions for herself. I made them for her." Harris, "That's not an answer to the question." Robert,
I controlled the situation. Yes. Harris, controlled or held in confinement.
Robert was silent for a minute. Then, quietly, one doesn't exclude the other. This was the closest to an admission the detectives could get. Robert had essentially confirmed he had kept Mary confined consciously, intentionally, for years. The lawyer asked for a break. Harris agreed. The interrogation was paused. But there was enough material. Robert's testimony contradicted the defense's version. He himself admitted control, admitted making decisions for Mary, admitted isolation. The prosecutor had everything needed for the indictment. Now the case depended on Mary's testimony and her willingness to speak about what she had endured. Mary was taken to the hospital immediately after her release. A team of specialists, led by Dr. Susan Wright, conducted a medical examination. They were to document the consequences of 16 years of captivity. The results were shocking even for experienced doctors. Mary's weight was 42 kilograms at a height of 1.65 meters. Critical emaciation. Dr. Wright noted such indicators are usually observed with prolonged starvation. Muscle atrophy. Mary could barely walk. Her legs refused to support her body weight.
Muscles had atrophied from lack of movement. The physical therapist assessed her condition as consistent with someone who had spent years in complete immobility. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Lack of sunlight led to a severe vitamin D deficiency. Tests showed levels 3 times below the critical norm. Her teeth were in a horrifying state. Multiple cavities, gum inflammation. The dentist recorded absence of oral hygiene for at least 10 years. Her vision was weakened. The ophthalmologist found that Mary's eyes struggled to adapt to bright light. Years in semi-darkness had altered her pupil reaction. The doctor noted reversible but will require long-term therapy. Her psychological state was assessed separately. Dr. Michael Thompson conducted a preliminary examination. Mary showed all signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, detachment, speech difficulties. She spoke quietly, in short phrases. She avoided eye contact. She answered simple questions with a delay, as if pondering each word. Dr. Thompson noted a classic picture of prolonged psychological trauma. Mary had spent so long in isolation that basic social skills had atrophied. Forensic experts requested samples for analysis. DNA from hair, skin, nails. They compared them with samples from the room on Maple Street. A complete match. Medical professionals documented marks on her wrists and ankles. Old scars, long healed. Dr. Wright suggested it's possible Mary was restrained at some point. Blood analysis showed chronic malnutrition. Protein, iron, essential vitamin levels, all critically low. Such a condition develops not over months. It is the result of years of inadequate nutrition. X-rays revealed an initial stage of osteoporosis. Her bones had become brittle from lack of movement and sunlight. Dr. Wright explained this is an irreversible process, typical for people who have spent years in confined spaces. All this medical data was compiled into a single document. The doctor's conclusion was unequivocal. Mary Hughes's condition is consistent with prolonged forcible confinement under conditions of limited nutrition, lack of sunlight, and minimal physical activity. This became irrefutable evidence. Robert's version of caring for her completely collapsed. No amount of care leads to such a state. The prosecutor received the medical report and handed it to Robert's lawyer. He offered a deal,
a plea bargain in exchange for a lighter sentence. The lawyer reviewed the documents. He realized that defense was pointless. The evidence was irrefutable. He recommended Robert accept the deal. But Robert refused. He insisted on his version. He believed he had acted correctly. The case was sent to court. Now, everything depended on whether Mary could testify against her husband. Detective Harris organized another interrogation, this time with new materials. Forensics experts had filmed a detailed video of the room where Mary was held, full documentation of every detail. Robert was brought into the interrogation room in the morning. His lawyer was already waiting. Cameras were turned on. Recording began. Harris placed a laptop on the table in front of Robert. He said calmly, "I want you to watch this, carefully." He opened the video file. The recording began with a wide shot. A room 3 by 3.5 meters, stale walls covered in scratches. The camera slowly panned around the room. A mattress on the floor, dirty, sunken, stained. A thin blanket, torn in several places.
A pillow without a pillowcase, gray with grime. Robert watched the screen without visible emotion. His face was calm, almost indifferent. His hands were clasped on the table. No tension. The video continued. The camera showed a corner of the room, a plastic bucket. Nearby, empty water bottles lined up, paper plates with dried food remnants, bread covered in mold. Harris observed Robert's reaction. None. He watched the video as if it were footage of someone else's house. There was no shame, no discomfort. The camera showed the walls in close-up. Scratches covered the entire surface at the level of a person sitting on the mattress. Thousands of small marks. The operator zoomed in on one section. It was visible how the scratches were initially neat, even. Then they became increasingly chaotic. By the end, they were just haphazard lines. Harris paused the video on this frame. He asked, "Did you see these scratches?" Robert nodded. "Yes." Harris, "Did you know your wife was counting the days?" Robert, "I presumed so." Harris, "And that didn't bother you?" Robert thought for a second. He replied, "She was safe. That's the main thing." Harris continued the video. The camera showed the door from the inside. A smooth surface, without a handle, without a keyhole. Impossible to open. The operator tried to push the door from the inside. It didn't move an inch. Then the window. The camera moved closer. The glass was intact, but outside were boards nailed with thick nails. Even if the glass were broken, escape was impossible. No light penetrated at all. Robert watched and remained silent. Harris stopped the video. He placed his hands on the table. He looked Robert in the eyes. He asked slowly, distinctly, "Do you understand what you've done?" Robert did not look away. He answered just as calmly, "I was ensuring my wife's safety." Harris took out printouts, Mary's medical report. He placed it in front of Robert. He began to read it aloud. Weight, 42 kilograms. Critical emaciation, muscle atrophy, inability to walk independently, vision impairment from lack of light, chronic vitamin deficiency. Robert listened without emotion. Harris finished reading. He asked, "Is this the result of care?" Robert replied without pause, "I gave her food every day, water, changed her clothes once a month, cleaned the bucket. What else was needed?" Harris lost his composure. He raised his voice. "Let her out. Call doctors. Allow her to see her family." Robert shook his head. It was impossible. She wouldn't cope with the outside world. She needed control. The lawyer intervened. He said, "Detective, my client is under pressure. I suggest we take a break." Harris ignored him. He took out Mary's notebook, opened it to the relevant page, began reading the entries aloud. May 15th, 2004. Please let me out. I promise I'll obey. June 3rd, 2004. I want to see Mom. Please, just once. August 12th, 2005. I can't take it anymore. Let me out. I'll do everything you say. Harris read entry after entry. Robert listened in silence. Harris closed the notebook. He asked, "For 16 years she pleaded for help. Did you hear?" Robert replied calmly, "I heard, but she didn't understand the situation. I understood better." Harris, "You made decisions for her?" Robert, "Yes, she couldn't make the right decisions." Harris, "Who gave you that right?" Robert looked at the detective in surprise. He answered as if it were obvious, "I am her husband." The lawyer asked to speak. He said that his client clearly did not realize the gravity of the situation.
Psychiatric help was needed, not an interrogation. Harris asked one last question. "Do you regret what you did?" Robert did not hesitate. He looked directly into the camera. He answered clearly, without hesitation, "No. I did what was necessary. I was protecting her." The interrogation concluded. Robert was let out. The lawyer remained. He said quietly to Harris, "I cannot defend him. He doesn't understand that he committed a crime." Harris nodded. That was precisely the problem. The recording was handed to the prosecutor. He reviewed it and concluded there could be no better proof of motive. Robert himself demonstrated a complete lack of empathy. Now it remained to hear Mary's version. The investigation scheduled a crime reconstruction procedure, standard practice for cases of this magnitude. Robert was to be brought to the house and asked to reenact his actions, to show exactly how he had kept Mary all these years. Detective Harris organized the procedure for the following week. Forensics experts, the prosecutor, and Robert's lawyer were present. All actions were recorded on video, for the court, for the record, for a complete picture of the crime. Robert was brought to the house on Maple Street in handcuffs. 2 officers accompanied him. He entered calmly, looked around, as if he had returned home after a short trip. Harris explained the procedure. Robert was to show and describe how his typical day unfolded, how he fed Mary, how he cleaned, how he controlled the situation. Robert agreed without objection. He said he was ready to cooperate. They started with the morning. Robert described his routine: waking up at 7 a.m., breakfast in the kitchen, coffee, toast, sometimes scrambled eggs. An ordinary morning for an ordinary person. At 8 o'clock, he prepared food for Mary. He demonstrated the process. He took canned goods from the cupboard, opened a can, placed it on a paper plate, added bread, poured water into a plastic bottle. Robert carried the plate to the room. He stopped at the door. He explained, "Here I would open the lock. I would place the plate on the floor inside. I would take the empty plate from yesterday's dinner." Forensics experts documented every movement. Robert demonstrated everything calmly, methodically, no emotions, just routine. Harris asked, "Did you talk to your wife?"
Robert replied, "Sometimes. I would ask how she was feeling. She usually didn't answer. Over time, I stopped asking." Robert showed how he emptied the bucket. Once a day, usually in the evening, he would open the door, take the bucket, carry it to the toilet, empty it, rinse it, return it. He described it as if he were talking about a trash can, an ordinary household chore. After feeding, Robert would return to his affairs. He worked remotely, at a computer in the living room, from 9 to 5 like an ordinary office worker. He processed documents, compiled reports, answered emails. At lunchtime, he would prepare food for himself. He ate in the kitchen,
Sometimes he would turn on the television. He watched the news. In the afternoon, if the weather allowed, he would go out into the yard. He mowed the lawn, watered flowers, swept the path. He chatted with neighbors if someone passed by. Robert showed this part of the day. He went into the yard, stood by the lawnmower. He explained, "I usually mowed the lawn on Wednesdays. It took about an hour. Neighbors saw me, said hello. Everything was normal." Harris listened and understood the full monstrosity of the situation.
Robert was mowing the lawn a few meters from the room where his wife was locked up. Life outside continued as usual. Inside, time had stopped 16 years ago. In the evening, Robert prepared food again, dinner for himself and for Mary. He showed the process, 2 portions on 2 plates. He kept one for himself and carried the second to the room. He would open the door, place the plate, take the lunch plate, close the door, lock it, return to his own dinner. After dinner, television. Robert would sit in his armchair, turn on evening programs, series, news, documentaries, an ordinary evening. At 10 p.m. he would go to bed. Robert showed his bedroom. The bed was neatly made. Nightstand, lamp, book. He slept peacefully, without nightmares. Forensics experts documented every detail. Robert went through the entire day, from waking up to sleeping. His routine was utterly mundane. Work, chores, leisure. The only difference was that twice a day he would open the door to the room. He fed the person locked inside. Then he continued to live as usual. Harris asked finally, "How often did you go into the room?" Robert thought. He replied, "Rarely, maybe once a month."
I would just open the door, check that everything was okay. Mary usually sat on the mattress. I would ask if she needed anything. She remained silent. I would close the door. The prosecutor listened and took notes. This reconstruction revealed the main point. Robert did not act impulsively. This was not a mistake or a temporary measure. It was a system. Well-oiled, regular, daily. 16 years of the same routine. Robert lived a normal life outside. He worked, socialized, managed his household, and in parallel, he kept his wife in confinement. The ordinariness of his actions, set against what was happening in that room, made everything even more horrifying. The reconstruction was completed. Robert was taken back. The materials were submitted to the court. Now the case awaited Mary's testimony. The trial began 6 months after Robert's arrest. Mary had been undergoing rehabilitation at a specialized center during this entire time. Doctors worked with her daily: physical therapy, psychological assistance, social adaptation. Progress was slow. Mary still had difficulty walking. She spoke quietly, in short phrases. She avoided people, was startled by loud noises.
16 years of isolation had left deep marks. The prosecutor insisted that Mary testify in court. This was critically important for the case, but psychologists warned she was not ready for direct contact with Robert. It could exacerbate her trauma. The court made a compromise decision. Mary would testify via video link in the presence of a psychologist. Robert would be able to see her on screen, but she would not see him. The hearing date was set for March 2020. The courtroom was full. Mary's relatives, journalists, the public. The case had received wide publicity. Everyone wanted to hear the victim's version. The judge announced the start of the session. The prosecutor presented the indictment: unlawful imprisonment with aggravating circumstances, torture, psychological abuse. Robert sat calmly at the defense table. Suit, tie, neat hairstyle. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man, not someone who had kept his wife locked up for 16 years.
Mary was given the floor, the screen turned on. She sat in a small room next to the psychologist, Dr. Thompson. Mary looked better than at the moment of her release. She had gained weight, her hair was cut.
But she was still very fragile, tense. The prosecutor began asking questions softly, cautiously. "Mary, tell us what happened in April 2003. Mary looked down. She spoke quietly. The microphone amplified her voice, but the words were still barely discernible. She said, "We argued. Robert was angry. I wanted to go to my mother's for a few days. He didn't allow it. He said I wasn't going anywhere." Prosecutor, what happened next? Mary, he locked me in that room. He said it was temporary, until I calmed down. I thought a day or two, but the door didn't open. Prosecutor, how long were you in there? Mary fell silent. She looked at the psychologist. Dr. Thompson quietly said something. Mary shook her head. She replied, "I don't know. I lost track of time. The years blurred into one." The prosecutor showed the notebook with her entries. He asked, "Do you remember writing this?" Mary nodded. "Yes. I asked him to let me out every day. He didn't listen." Prosecutor, did he explain why he was keeping you there? Mary, he said I was sick, that I needed isolation, that he was taking care of me. But I wasn't sick. I just wanted to go home. Mary's voice trembled. Thompson placed a hand on her shoulder. Mary paused, composed herself. She continued, "I screamed. I pounded on the door. I scratched the walls. No one heard. Or they heard but didn't help." Prosecutor, what did you feel all those years? Mary, fear, despair. I thought I would die there, that no one would find me, that my life would end like that. There was absolute silence in the courtroom. Everyone listened, motionless. The defense attorney was given the floor for cross-examination. He cautiously tried to question Mary's testimony. He asked about her mental state before 2003, about depression, about treatment. Mary replied, "Yes, I had depression, but that didn't make me dangerous. I went to therapy. I took medication. I lived a normal life." Your husband claims you asked him to isolate you. Mary raised her voice for the first time. "That's a lie. I never asked to be locked up. Never." The lawyer did not press further. The cross-examination concluded. The judge gave the floor to Robert. He stood up. He looked at the screen where Mary was. He said calmly, "I acted for her good. I protected her. She didn't understand what was best for her." Mary, on the screen, covered her face with her hands. Dr. Thompson hugged her. The judge interrupted Robert. He said, "Enough." The hearing lasted 3 days. Witnesses, experts, relatives' testimonies. Every element of the case was examined in detail. The jury retired to deliberate. They returned 4 hours later. Verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge set the sentencing date for a week later. When the day arrived, the courtroom was full again. The judge read out the sentence. Robert Hughes is found guilty of unlawful imprisonment with aggravating circumstances, sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert listened without emotion. He didn't flinch, didn't change his expression. He accepted the sentence as calmly as he once fed his wife through the door of the locked room. He was led away. The case was closed. Mary began a new life, a long, difficult road to recovery. A year after her release, Mary agreed to her first interview. The meeting took place at the rehabilitation center where she continued her treatment. A photograph from this interview later circulated through all news outlets.
Mary sat in an armchair by the window. Sunlight fell on her face. She looked completely different than on the night of her liberation. She had gained weight. Her skin had a healthy color. Her hair was neatly cut, dressed simply but tastefully. But her eyes still remained wary. Years of confinement cannot be erased in 12 months. Dr. Susan Wright, her attending physician, told journalists about the recovery process. It was a long, agonizing journey. Mary had to relearn basic things. Walking. For the first few months, she could only move with crutches. Her muscles had atrophied so severely that her legs refused to support her body. Physical therapy every day for several hours. Slowly, step by step, Mary regained her ability to move. Dr. Wright stated, by the end of the first year, Mary could walk independently. Not quickly, not far, but it was enormous progress. Interacting with people. Psychologist Dr. Thompson worked with Mary daily. 16 years of isolation had destroyed her social skills. Mary was afraid of people, avoided contact, panicked in the presence of strangers. Therapy involved gradually introducing social interactions. First, one person in the room, then two, then a group. Each step was difficult.
Dr. Thompson noted, trauma of this magnitude doesn't just disappear. Mary will need support her entire life, but she is making progress. Trusting the world. Mary had lost faith in people. The one she trusted most had betrayed her in the cruelest way. Restoring that trust proved to be the hardest task. Psychologists worked on this aspect especially carefully. Mary needed to understand that not all people are like Robert, that the world can be safe. By the end of the first year, she began to open up. She befriended several patients at the center. She spoke with staff without fear. Small steps, but important ones. Mary's relatives also gave interviews. Her sister, Jennifer, told journalists about the feeling of guilt that haunted her every day. She said, "I knew something was wrong. Robert isolated Mary long before 2003. I saw signs of control, but I didn't attach importance to them. I thought it was their family business." Jennifer cried during the interview. She repeated, "I should have insisted. I should have checked. Maybe then Mary wouldn't have spent 16 years in that room." Neighbors also felt guilty. Barbara King, who had lived next door for 30 years, said, "I believed Robert. He seemed like a normal person, polite, calm. Who could have imagined such a thing happening behind a closed door?" Other neighbors confirmed. Robert was part of their community. He said hello, helped out, engaged in conversations. No signs that he was keeping his wife locked up. This was what was most frightening. The crime took place in plain sight, in an ordinary house on a quiet street among normal people, and no one noticed. The Mary Hughes case created enormous public resonance. The media wrote about it for months. It was discussed on talk shows, analyzed in documentaries. The main question was the same everywhere. How could such a thing happen? How, in the modern world, with social services, police, and neighbors, can a person be isolated for 16 years? Experts explained, this is a classic case of hidden domestic control. Robert created a perfect cover. He didn't deny his wife's existence, didn't hide her completely. He simply controlled information. Psychologist and domestic violence expert Dr. Elizabeth Grant commented, "Such cases are more common than they seem." Isolation is not always physical. Sometimes it's psychological control, financial dependence, social isolation. Mary's case became an extreme form, but the pattern was the same. Legislators used this case as a basis for tightening laws on domestic control. Several states introduced mandatory checks when a person is absent from public spaces for an extended period.
Social services reviewed protocols. Now, if a person disappears from social life and relatives claim it's for treatment, confirmation from a medical institution is required. Mary continues to recover. She moved in with her sister Jennifer, slowly returning to a normal life, attending therapy, meeting friends, walking in the park. She will never return to who she was before 2003. 16 years cannot be erased. But she has a chance at a new life. And Robert Hughes will spend the rest of his days in prison, 30 years without the possibility of parole. He still does not admit guilt. Mary's story reminds us, monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they mow the lawn, greet their neighbors, and look completely ordinary.